She was judged without a voice, expelled from her own story. Months later, he reappears and finds the truth growing in the womb he abandoned. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing. Marina always knew she was different from the other women in her family, not because of something she lacked, but because of everything that overflowed within her, which others couldn't see. While her older sister Isabella shone in the ballrooms of London high society, with her designer dresses and calculated smiles, Marina preferred the silent library of the Hamilton Price family mansion, lost between pages that transported her to worlds where the heart mattered more than the surname. The family home in Knightsbridge was a monument to the corporate success of the patriarch Robert Hamilton Price, owner of one of the largest construction firms in the country. Imported marble covered the floors, crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and priceless artworks adorned the walls. It was a residence featured in architectural magazines and hosted London's economic elite for dinners that lasted until the early hours. But for Marina, that house had always been more a museum than a home. Her mother, Helen, was the personification of a high society woman, platinum blonde, thin as a hanger, always impeccably dressed and with a tongue sharp as a razor. Helen had the cruel gift of making every word sound like a sentence, especially when addressing her younger daughter. Marina had grown up hearing whispers and malicious comments her mother made when she thought Marina wasn't listening. "Isabella is our princess," Helen would say to friends during charity luncheons. "Beautiful, elegant, perfect for any man from a good family. As for Marina," and the phrase would always hang in the air, laden with disappointment and disdain. Marina was not ugly. She had piercing green eyes, straight brown hair that gleamed in the sun, soft skin and delicate features. But her beauty was subtle, discreet. It didn't scream for attention like her sisters. And more importantly, Marina wasn't interested in the game of appearances that dominated family life. She preferred reading to parading, discussing books to gossiping about others, and wearing comfortable clothes to squeezing into tight dresses. This difference in temperament was always seen as a flaw by the family. "Marina is so ordinary," Helen would sigh when friends asked about her daughters. "She doesn't have that special sparkle a girl of our standing should have." Her father, Robert, when not traveling for business or locked in his office late at night, barely noticed his daughter's presence. To him, Isabella was the trophy he displayed at corporate events, always accompanied by some young heir from a traditional family. Marina was practically invisible to his eyes, a silent presence who moved through the house without causing a stir or glory. Isabella, in turn, treated her younger sister with a condescending superiority that hurt more than any shout. "Poor Marina," she would say, feigning pity. "So intelligent but utterly dull. Lucky Dad has money, right? Otherwise she'd be an old maid for sure." For years, Marina accepted this supporting role in her own family. She graduated in literature from the University of London, earned a master's degree, and collaborated with NGOs working in early childhood education. She had her own life, discreet but meaningful. At 26, she had found relative peace in her domestic invisibility, building her identity away from the family spotlight. But fate, as always, had other plans. The crisis arrived like a hurricane no one saw coming. Or rather, Robert saw it, but preferred to ignore the signs, betting on risky investments and loans that promised impossible profits. The Hamilton Price construction firm, which for decades had been synonymous with solidity in the real estate market, began to crumble like a house of cards. First came construction delays, then labor lawsuits. Next, federal investigations into overbilling and corruption. Robert tried to suppress the scandals with his political influence, but the tide had already turned. The press uncovered the irregularities. Investors fled like rats from a sinking ship, and within months the family's financial empire was hanging by a thread. The Knightsbridge house, which had always represented status and power, suddenly became the scene of desperate meetings between Robert and his lawyers. Helen locked herself in her room for days, refusing to accept that her luxurious life could be coming to an end. Isabella, who had just graduated in business administration and expected to take a prominent position in the family company, saw all her plans collapse along with the construction firm's shares. It was at this moment of total despair that the saving proposal appeared, or what seemed to be a salvation. Edward Foster was a well-known name in the country's business circles, although he kept away from the capital's spotlight. Owner of one of the largest rural properties in the American heartland, he had built a silent empire based on agribusiness, mining, and renewable energy. His lands stretched for thousands of acres between Kansas and Nebraska, a property the size of some European countries. Edward and Robert had been college colleagues decades ago, before taking completely different paths. While Robert built skyscrapers in London, Edward planted roots in the Great Plains. When he learned of the crisis plaguing his old friend, Edward made a proposal that seemed too generous to be true. He offered to buy the construction firm's entire debt, saving the company from bankruptcy and preserving the Hamilton Price family name. In return, he wanted only one thing: that one of Robert's daughters marry his nephew and heir, Luke Foster, a 32-year-old man who managed a significant portion of the family lands. The proposal was presented on a rainy June afternoon in Robert's office. Edward was passing through London and wanted to speak personally with his old friend. Tall, with greying hair, hands marked by work in the sun, he completely contrasted with the urban and sophisticated atmosphere of the office. "It's not about money, Robert," Edward explained, his voice slow, like someone choosing each word carefully. "My nephew is a good man, hard-working, honest, but he lives too isolated out in the countryside. He needs a companion who brings a bit of culture, refined education. A girl from your family would be perfect." Robert, desperate and without alternatives, accepted the proposal almost instantly. To him it was an easy deal. Trade a daughter for all the lost financial stability. The difficulty would be convincing one of the girls to accept the arrangement. When the proposal was presented to the family, Isabella's reaction was immediate and dramatic. "Never!" she screamed, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I'm not going to bury myself in the middle of nowhere to marry some bumpkin who probably doesn't even know how to use a fork and knife properly. I spent my entire life preparing to marry someone from our social class, not just any farmer." Helen supported her eldest daughter unconditionally. "Isabella is right, Robert. She's a refined young woman, educated in France, prepared to frequent high society. She can't throw her life away because of your mistakes." It was then that all eyes turned to Marina. She was sitting in the corner of the sofa, as always, observing the family discussion without interfering. Throughout the conversation, she had maintained a prudent silence, but inside her heart raced, not from fear of the unknown, but from the possibility, unimaginable until that moment, of finally escaping that house that had never been a home. "Marina can go," Helen declared, as if discarding an object no longer useful. "She was always more simple. She'll adapt better to country life. And let's be honest, it's a unique opportunity for her to get a husband." Robert nodded in agreement, relieved to have found a solution that didn't contradict Isabella. Marina was always more independent anyway, and this man must be a decent person if he's Edward's nephew. Isabella laughed with a cruelty that made the air heavy. "Perfect. Marina always complained she didn't fit in here anyway. Now she can go live the simple life she loves so much, far from civilization." Marina heard all of it with a strange mixture of pain and liberation. The family was literally getting rid of her, as if she were a burden they could finally drop. The words hurt, but behind the pain was something she hadn't felt in years: hope. That night, locked in her room, Marina looked out the window at the city lights she had never considered her own. All her life, she had felt like a stranger in that world of appearances and superficiality. Perhaps fate was finally offering an exit door. Of course she was afraid. How could she not be? She was being sent to marry a complete stranger, to live in a region of the country she only knew from books and documentaries. But she also felt an ardent curiosity about who this man would be, who had agreed to marry the ugly daughter of the Hamilton Price family. In the days that followed, while Helen and Isabella made sure to emphasize how lucky Marina was to have secured a marriage, however unsuitable it might be, Marina did her own research. She discovered that Luke Foster had studied agricultural engineering at a university in Washington, D.C., specialized in the United States, and was nationally recognized for his sustainable farming practices. In the few photos she found online, she saw a man with a serious expression, broad shoulders, and skin tanned by the Great Plains sun. He didn't look like the spoiled young men who frequented Isabella's parties. There was something solid, real in that face that intrigued her. The last week in London was a succession of humiliations disguised as preparations. Helen insisted on selecting appropriate country clothes, that is, simple and cheap, so Marina wouldn't create inappropriate expectations about her new life. Isabella contributed venomous comments about how interesting it would be to see Marina trying to adapt to a reality so distant from what she knew. Robert, meanwhile, barely appeared at home, relieved to have solved his problems, without further complications. The night before the trip, Marina did something she had never done before. She confronted her mother directly. "Why have you always hated me so much?" she asked, standing in the doorway of her parents' bedroom, where Helen was arranging her expensive jewelry in a velvet box. Helen didn't even look up. "Don't be melodramatic, Marina. I never hated you. I merely acknowledge your limitations. You were never like Isabella, never had that attention-grabbing presence. It's better to marry someone at your level than to remain an old maid here, disrupting our social life." "My level," Marina repeated, feeling her chest burn. "And what exactly would my level be, Mother?" Helen finally faced her with that cold gaze Marina knew so well. "You're a good girl, Marina, but you were always too ordinary for our circles. A bit odd, full of strange ideas about helping others, about literature, about those things that interest no one. Perhaps in the countryside you'll find people who appreciate your different way." Marina nodded slowly, finally understanding that she would never be accepted in that house, no matter how hard she tried to fit into the mold the family had created for her. "You're right, Mother. I really don't belong here." And for the first time in a long time, Marina smiled as she said it. On the morning of her departure, only the family driver, old John, showed any genuine emotion as he bid her farewell. A humble man who had worked for the Hamilton Prices for years, he carefully carried her simple suitcase to the car and said softly, "You're a golden girl, Miss Marina. Anyone who doesn't see that is blind." Marina hugged the old driver with tears in her eyes. It was the first time in years that anyone in that house had shown her true affection. Robert appeared briefly for a formal farewell. Helen waved from the window without coming down, and Isabella didn't even bother to leave her room. It was as if Marina was simply disappearing, being erased from the Hamilton Price family history. As the plane took off from London City Airport, heading for Dulles International Airport, Marina watched London shrink below until it became mere points of light. She felt as if she was leaving behind not just a city, but an entire version of herself that had never truly been hers. The flight lasted 2 hours, during which Marina reread a letter that Edward Foster had sent, briefly introducing his nephew and describing the property where she would live. The words were cordial but direct, painting a picture of a simple but dignified life, far from the noise and falseness of the big city. When the plane landed in Washington, D.C., Marina felt her heart race. A pickup truck with a driver was waiting for her at the airport to take her to the ranch, which was 3 hours away. Throughout the journey, she watched the landscape gradually change. First the federal capital with its futuristic architecture, then small towns, finally just the Great Plains stretching to the horizon, under an immense sky that seemed to touch the earth. The sun was setting when they finally spotted the gates of St. Helens Ranch, the Foster family property. Marina stepped out of the truck, her legs trembling, carrying her small suitcase and a heart beating too fast. It was then that she saw him. Luke Foster was leaning against the porch of the main house, arms crossed, observing her arrival with an expression Marina couldn't decipher. Tall, exactly as in the photos she had seen, but much more imposing in person. He wore a simple shirt, faded jeans, and worn boots. His dark hair was slightly disheveled by the wind, and his eyes, deep brown eyes like the Great Plains soil, studied her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed. For an interminable moment, they just looked at each other across the distance that separated them, two strangers whom fate had united without consulting their wills. Marina felt the world stop around her, as if that moment would define the rest of her life, and in a way that was exactly what was happening. Luke pushed off the porch and walked slowly towards Marina, each step echoing in the silence of the Great Plains dusk. She remained motionless beside the pickup truck, holding her simple suitcase with both hands, as if that object were her only link to the world she knew. When he approached close enough for her to see the details of his face, Marina felt the air leave her lungs. Luke's eyes were more intense than any photograph could capture. It wasn't just the deep brown color, but the way they seemed to see through her, as if they could read every insecurity, every wound, every hidden hope she carried. There was a seriousness in that gaze that contrasted completely with the frivolous and superficial young men she had known in London. "Marina Hamilton Price," he said, stopping 2 meters away. His voice was deep, deliberate, with the soft American heartland accent that made each word more significant. "I'm Luke Foster." She nodded, trying to find her own voice. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Foster." "Luke," he corrected with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We don't use many formalities here." He paused, studying her again. "I imagine it was a long journey." "It was peaceful," Marina lied, because in truth nothing had been peaceful in the past few days. Her entire life had been turned upside down. She had been practically banished from home, and now she stood before a man who was formerly her future husband, though they were complete strangers. Luke seemed to sense her tension because his expression softened slightly. "Come, I'll show you the house. Mary Ann has prepared a room for you and dinner. You must be hungry." He took the suitcase from her hands without asking permission, and Marina noticed how his fingers were calloused from work, completely different from the soft, manicured hands of the men she knew in London. There was something honest and real in those marks of labor that intrigued her. They walked together towards the main house, and Marina took the opportunity to observe her surroundings. The property was very different from what she had imagined. She expected something rustic and simple, but St. Helens Ranch had a grandeur of its own, wild and imposing. The main house was spacious and single-story, built in a colonial American style, with raw adobe walls and a red ceramic roof. Wide verandas surrounded the entire building, protected by solid wooden columns. Carefully tended gardens blended with the native Great Plains vegetation, creating a harmonious balance between the civilized and the wild. Buriti palm trees swayed gently in the afternoon wind, and the distant sound of running water indicated the presence of a nearby creek. "It's beautiful," Marina said, genuinely impressed. "My grandfather built this house in the 50s, Luke explained, opening the front door. He wanted something that respected the land that was part of it, not something that fought against it. The interior of the house confirmed the impression of solidity and authenticity. The furniture was made of dark wood, heavy and well-made, mixed with pieces of local craftsmanship. The wide plank floor creaked slightly underfoot, a welcoming sound that told stories of decades of family life. The walls displayed old photographs, maps of the property, and some pieces of folk art that gave color and personality to the environment. "Marina, welcome." The feminine voice made Marina turn to find a woman of about 50 approaching with open arms. Short, robust, with grey hair tied in a loose bun and a floral apron tied at her waist, she radiated human warmth in a way Marina's mother never could. "This is Mary Ann," Luke introduced. "She's been taking care of the house for over 20 years, practically raised me after my parents died." Mary Ann hugged Marina with a strength that surprised her, a true hug from someone genuinely happy with her presence. "Pretty girl. Finally a young woman in this house. I was starting to think this boy would become a hermit for good." Marina felt tears prick her eyes. It had been so long since someone had welcomed her with genuine affection that she had forgotten how good that feeling was. "Is her room ready?" Luke asked. "All ready. I chose the back room, which has a view of the creek. I thought she'd like the sound of the water." Mary Ann took Marina's hand. "Come, dear. I'll show you where you'll be staying." The room they had prepared for Marina was spacious and airy, with large windows overlooking a small creek that wound through the trees. The bed was white painted iron, covered with a colourful handmade quilt. A wooden desk occupied a corner near the window, and empty shelves awaited the books she had brought. "It's perfect," Marina said, lightly touching the quilt. "Thank you for going to the trouble." "No trouble at all, child. It was a pleasure to prepare this room. This house has needed a feminine presence for a long time." Mary Ann opened the closet, showing empty hangers. "You can unpack your things at your leisure. Dinner will be ready in an hour." When she was alone, Marina sat on the bed, and for the first time in days, allowed her emotions to surface. She cried silently, not only from the pain of being rejected by her family, but also from a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt expected. Desired, perhaps, was too strong a word, but at least she wasn't seen as a nuisance. Dinner was served on the back porch, at a wooden table lit by lanterns that created an intimate and cozy atmosphere. Mary Ann had prepared typical regional dishes: grilled catfish, sweet potato rice, plantain farofa, tomato and cilantro vinaigrette, completely new flavors for Marina's palate, accustomed to London sophistication. Luke ate in silence, observing her discreetly as she sampled each dish with genuine curiosity. There was nothing forced or polite in her gestures. She truly seemed interested in experiencing this new cuisine. "Are you enjoying it?" he asked, when Marina took a second helping of the plantain farofa. "Very much. It's completely different from what I'm used to, but it has a true flavor." She paused, searching for the right words. In London, food always seemed more like a performance than nourishment. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Performance?" Marina blushed slightly, realizing she might have said too much about her previous life. "My mother only cared about trendy restaurants, famous chefs, dishes that looked good in magazine photos. We rarely ate anything that was honest." "Honest," Luke repeated, as if testing the word. "I like that expression." They continued eating in a silence that, surprisingly, was not uncomfortable. Marina watched Luke eat, noticing how his movements were economical and precise, unhurried but without wasted time. Everything about him seemed to reflect a connection to the land and to life's more natural rhythms. "May I ask a question?" Marina ventured, after Mary Ann had cleared the main courses and brought out a dessert of dulce de leche with cheese. "You may." "Why did you accept this arrangement? I mean, you didn't even know me." Luke stopped eating and looked directly at her. For a moment, Marina thought he wouldn't answer, but then he leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. "My Uncle Edward told me about your family's situation, about how they were treating you." His voice carried a note of harshness when he said this. "Any decent man would be appalled by what I heard." Marina lowered her eyes, feeling shame burn her cheeks. "What exactly did he say?" "That you were treated as if you were a burden, a nuisance. That your family wanted to get rid of you as if you were a broken object." Luke paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more intense. "That infuriated me, Marina. No one should be treated like that, especially not by family." She looked up, surprised by the contained anger in his voice. "But that doesn't answer my question. Why did you want to help me? You owed me nothing." Luke was silent for a long moment, looking at the lanterns flickering in the night breeze. When he finally responded, there was something vulnerable in his voice. "Because I know what it's like to feel inadequate for your family." He looked at her again. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 16. I came to live here with my Uncle Edward, but I always felt like I was in the way, like an obligation he had taken on. It took me years to understand that true family is one that accepts you as you are, not one that tries to mold you into what it thinks you should be." Marina felt her chest tighten at the raw honesty of those words. "I'm sorry for the loss of your parents. It was a long time ago." Luke shrugged, but Marina perceived that the pain was still there, just well guarded. "What I mean is that when my uncle told me about you, about how your family treated you, I thought maybe we could help each other." "Help each other how?" "You need a place where you can be respected for who you are. He hesitated, as if revealing something very personal. I need someone who understands that not everything in life is about appearance and status. They looked at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Marina felt something stir in her chest, an emotion she couldn't name but which was warm and frightening at the same time. "What if it doesn't work out?" she asked softly. "Then at least you will have had the chance to discover who you really are, away from people who can't see your worth." That night Marina lay in her new bed, listening to the gentle sound of the creek outside. Through the open window, a fresh breeze carried scents she didn't know: wet earth, wildflowers, grass. It was so different from the urban noises she was used to, that she felt as if she had arrived on another planet. But it wasn't a hostile planet. There was something welcoming in those new sounds and smells, something that made her feel that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she was where she was supposed to be. The first few days on the ranch were a constant discovery. Luke woke her early, not out of cruelty, but because rural life followed the rhythm of the sun. He showed her the property little by little, the corrals where they raised Hereford cattle, the soybean and cornfields that stretched beyond the horizon, the sustainable irrigation systems he had implemented. Marina found herself genuinely interested in everything. She asked intelligent questions about planting techniques, about preserving the Great Plains, about the challenges of modern agriculture. Luke, who initially answered only out of politeness, began to realize that she wasn't just being polite, she really wanted to understand. "Did you study agriculture?" he asked one afternoon when she had made a particularly insightful remark about crop rotation. "No, but I read a lot about environmental sustainability during my master's." Marina was sitting on a fence watching a group of capybaras that had come down to drink water from the pond. "I've always been interested in the intersection of technology and nature." Luke watched her for a moment. The afternoon sun gilded her face, and her brown hair shone with highlights he hadn't noticed before. She had traded her urban clothes for simple jeans and a cotton shirt that Mary Ann had arranged. Without makeup, her face slightly flushed by the sun, she looked real. Alive in a way that the polished women of his social class never seemed. "Why literature, then?" he asked, genuinely curious. Marina smiled, a smile that had none of the forced shyness that marked her interactions in London. "Because stories teach us about possibilities, about people who found different ways to live, to love, to be happy." She looked at him. "And you? Did you always want to work the land?" "Always. Even when my parents insisted I should study in the capital, go to a respectable university." He made air quotes with an ironic smile. To them, agriculture was for uneducated people. "And now you're a national reference in sustainable practices. I imagine they'd be proud." Luke felt something tighten in his chest. Marina had said that without calculation, without ulterior motives, simply because she genuinely believed what she was saying. When was the last time someone had shown genuine admiration for his work? "Thank you," he said simply. Weeks passed, and a routine established itself between them. Marina helped Mary Ann in the house in the morning, then accompanied Luke in his activities around the ranch. In the evenings, they dined together on the porch, talking about books, about the land, about dreams and future plans. Marina blossomed in that environment. Her skin gained a healthy golden color, her eyes shone with a new vivacity. She learned to ride a horse, to identify Great Plains plants, to understand the ranch's cycles. More importantly, she learned to laugh without worrying if she was laughing too loudly, to speak without measuring every word, to be herself without apologizing. Luke observed this transformation with growing fascination. The shy, subdued young woman who had arrived weeks ago was revealing herself to be an intelligent, funny woman, full of interesting opinions and a quiet courage that he admired. And little by little he realized he was falling in love with her. It hadn't been part of the plan. The marriage was supposed to be an arrangement of convenience, a way for both to find stability and companionship. But Marina had become much more than a convenience. She had become necessary. The awareness of this change arrived one afternoon when she was reading under a tree near the creek, completely absorbed in a book. Luke watched her for several minutes, admiring the way she slightly furrowed her brow when concentrating, how she bit her lower lip when something intrigued her. And suddenly he understood that he could no longer imagine the ranch without her. It was a realization both wonderful and terrifying, because he had no idea if Marina felt anything similar for him or if she was still there just because she had nowhere else to go. That night after dinner, they walked together to the edge of the pond. The full moon mirrored in the water, and the sound of crickets created a nocturnal symphony that Marina had learned to love. "Luke," she said suddenly, "can I ask you a personal question?" "You can. Do you regret it? Accepting this arrangement?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. The moonlight made her face almost ethereal, and Luke felt his heart race. "No," he said with a certainty that surprised him. "And you?" Marina looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when she did, there was something new in her voice, something that made Luke's blood run faster. "No. In fact, I think this is the first time in my life that something has truly gone right." And when she smiled, Luke knew he was completely lost. Autumn arrived in the Great Plains, transforming the landscape into a symphony of golden and red hues. Marina had learned to love that season, when the air grew drier and fresher, and the afternoons stretched out lazily under a less relentless sun. 3 months had passed since her arrival at St. Helens Ranch, and she barely recognized herself in the woman looking back from the mirror. Her hair had grown and now fell in natural waves over her shoulders, free from the geometric cuts her mother always insisted she maintain. Her skin, golden from the country sun, had a healthy glow that no expensive cosmetic had ever managed to give her. But the deepest change was in her eyes. Where once there had been insecurity and resignation, now shone a new confidence, a strength she didn't even know she possessed. Luke had noticed every detail of this transformation. In fact, he had spent the last few weeks in a state of constant internal turmoil, battling feelings that grew daily and made her presence both necessary and torturous. Marina was becoming more beautiful in his eyes, not only physically, but in a profound and unsettling way that challenged his convictions about arranged relationships and matrimonial conveniences. The tension between them had changed in quality. Where before there was only respectful courtesy, now there were glances that lasted longer than they should, hands that touched accidentally during work, conversations that stretched late into the night, as if neither wanted to break the enchantment of those moments. Mary Ann observed everything with the wisdom of someone who had raised Luke and knew every nuance of his temperament. She saw how he found excuses to stay close to Marina during the day, how his eyes followed her when she wasn't looking, how he became more attentive and careful whenever she approached. "That boy is in love," Mary Ann murmured to herself, watching Luke teach Marina to milk the ranch's gentlest cow. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they had decided she should learn all the basic activities of rural life. Marina was concentrating, trying to follow Luke's instructions on how to position her hands, but his proximity was making her nervous. He was right behind her, his hands covering hers to guide the movement, and she could feel the warmth emanating from his body, the clean, masculine scent she had learned to associate with security and strength. "Like this," Luke said, his voice hoarser than he intended, firmly but without rushing. Marina tried to focus on the task, but she was hyper-aware of every point where Luke's body touched hers. When she finally managed to make the milk squirt into the bucket, she turned to celebrate and found herself much closer to him than she had calculated. For an interminable moment, they stood there, their faces mere inches apart, the air charged with an electricity neither knew how to handle. Luke's eyes dropped to Marina's lips, and she felt her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Marina," he began, with a voice she had never heard before, laden with a tension that made her stomach churn, with anticipation. But the moment was broken by the sound of a car approaching the main house. Luke quickly moved away, running a hand through his hair with a frustrated expression, while Marina tried to regain her normal breathing. "It must be my uncle," he said, recognizing the engine sound. Edward Foster had arrived for one of his monthly visits to the property, but this time he wasn't alone. With him came Mark Spencer, an agribusiness entrepreneur from Kansas City who was interested in forming a partnership with St. Helens Ranch. Marina was introduced to the visitors as "my fiancé," a word Luke pronounced with a naturalness that made her feel butterflies in her stomach. Edward greeted her with his usual cordiality, but Mark studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "So you're the famous fiancé of Luke," Mark said, kissing her hand in a way that lasted longer than necessary. "Edward told me you come from a traditional London family." "Yes, sir," Marina replied, trying to withdraw her hand without being rude. Mark was a man in his 40s, artificially tanned, wearing expensive clothes that screamed ostentation. His smile had something predatory that immediately activated all of Marina's internal alarms. He reminded her too much of the men she had known in London, superficial, calculating, interested only in appearances. During dinner, Mark monopolized the conversation with stories about his business successes, his international travels, his imported cars. Edward and Luke listened out of politeness, but Marina perceived that both were uncomfortable with the visitor's arrogance. "Marina, you must miss life in the capital," Mark said, turning to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A refined young lady like you must find all this here very rustic." "Actually, no," Marina replied, with a firmness that surprised everyone at the table, including herself. "I've discovered I prefer authenticity to empty sophistication." The comment generated a tense silence. Luke looked at her with something that seemed like pride, but Mark frowned. "How interesting," he said with a condescending tone. "But I'm sure an intelligent woman like you understands that there are greater opportunities elsewhere. Urban centers offer prospects that the countryside cannot provide." Marina felt anger boil within her. It was the same superior attitude she had faced all her life in London, the idea that her life only had value if it met others' expectations. "What kind of prospects?" she asked with a dangerous calm. "Culture, society, refinement, things a woman of your education must value." Mark leaned forward, completely ignoring Luke's increasingly closed expression. "In fact, I'm expanding my business to London. Perhaps we could discuss some opportunities." "Mark," Luke's voice cut through the air like a blade, "I think you've misunderstood the situation." "How so?" "Marina isn't interested in your opportunities. She's here because she wants to be, and I suggest you respect that choice." Luke's icy tone made Mark recoil slightly, but he tried to disguise it with a forced laugh. "Relax. Man, it's just friendly conversation." "We're not friends," Luke said, standing up from the table, "and now I think it's best you leave." The tension in the room was palpable. Edward tried to mediate the situation, but Luke had already made his decision. Mark left indignant, promising future problems, but Luke showed no regret. When they were alone on the porch, Marina looked at Luke with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You lost a deal because of me." "I lost nothing worth having." Luke looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "No one will disrespect you in my presence." "Why?" The question came out softer than Marina intended, laden with all the insecurities she still carried, all the times she had been belittled and humiliated. Luke approached her, raising a hand to gently touch her face. "Because you're not just my fiancée on paper, Marina. You are—" He stopped, as if the words were too big to be spoken. "I am what?" she insisted, leaning slightly into his touch. "You are important to me. More important than any business, any money, anything." The kiss happened as an inevitability. Luke tilted his head and met Marina's lips with a gentleness that contrasted with the contained passion in his eyes. She responded instinctively, feeling as if her entire body was awakening to something that had always been dormant. When they separated, both were breathing heavily. Marina touched her own lips, still tasting him, still processing the intensity of that moment. "Luke," she began, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything now," he said, though his eyes pleaded for some confirmation that she had felt the same as he. "Just think about what happened here." That night, Marina couldn't sleep. She walked around the room, touching her lips repeatedly, reliving every second of that kiss. It wasn't just the physical sensation that disturbed her, but the way Luke had defended her, the way he had said she was important. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever considered her presence more valuable than a lucrative business. For the first time in her life, she felt truly desired, not just tolerated. But along with the happiness came fear. Fear that it was just a moment of weakness, fear that Luke would regret it in the morning, fear that she was misinterpreting the signals she thought she was receiving. On the other side of the house, Luke also spent the night awake, grappling with his own turmoil. The kiss had unleashed feelings he had been suppressing for weeks, but it had also complicated a situation that was supposed to be simple. How could he explain to Marina that what had started as a convenient arrangement had turned into the most important thing in his life? The days that followed were marked by a different tension between them. There was a new awareness in every interaction, an electric charge that made the air denser whenever they were in the same room. They touched more, looked more deeply into each other's eyes, talked about more intimate things. Marina told Luke about her lonely childhood, about how she had grown up feeling inadequate, about the dreams she had abandoned to try to fit into family expectations. Luke, in turn, opened up about the pain of losing his parents so young, about how he had channeled his energy into the land as a way to cope with the loss, about his own fears of inadequacy and loneliness. "Sometimes I think," Marina said one afternoon as they watched the sunset from the porch, "if everything that happened wasn't fate pushing me to where I was meant to be all along." "And where is that?" Luke asked, though he knew the answer could change his life. "Here," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "with you." It was the second time they kissed, and this time there was no hesitation from either side. The kiss was deeper, more urgent, laden with weeks of accumulated tension and feelings that could no longer be denied. When they separated, Luke rested his forehead on hers, both breathing heavily. "Marina," he said with a husky voice that sent shivers down her spine, "I don't want to pretend anymore that this is just a convenient arrangement." "Me neither," she whispered. "I don't know when it happened, but I fell in love with you," Luke said, finally putting into words what they both already knew. "Completely, irremediably in love." "Me too," Marina admitted, feeling as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders. "I love you, Luke, in a way I didn't even know was possible." They spent hours on the porch, talking about feelings and future plans, about how they wanted to build a life together that was real, not based on obligations or conveniences. It was a conversation that should have happened before the wedding, but perhaps could only have happened after they truly got to know each other. "When are we making it official?" Luke asked, playing with Marina's fingers. "Making what official?" "The wedding. I want you to be my wife for real, not just on paper." Marina felt her heart race. The idea of marrying Luke had completely changed meaning. Before it was escape, survival. Now it was choice, love, future. "Are you sure?" she asked, because she still carried deep insecurities about her own worth. Luke kissed her again, this time with a tenderness that answered all her doubts. "I've never been sure of anything like this." They set the wedding for a month later, a simple ceremony on the ranch, with only close friends and staff from the property. Marina called London to communicate the date to her family, more out of protocol than expectation that anyone would attend. The reaction was exactly what she expected. "It's about time," Helen said, with a tone that suggested Marina was finally fulfilling an obligation. "I hope you're behaving properly there in the countryside." "I'm very happy, Mother," Marina said, trying to infuse sincerity into her voice. "Happy?" Helen laughed as if the word were absurd. "Marina, you're in the middle of nowhere, married to a farmer. Happiness is too strong a word for this situation." Marina felt the familiar anger rise in her throat, but this time she had the strength to fight back. "Mother, I'm in love. Luke is a wonderful man and I—" "In love? Marina, please be more realistic. You should be grateful you managed to get a husband. Considering your limitations, you don't need to invent romantic stories." The call ended with Marina hanging up the phone hard enough to catch the attention of Luke, who was working at the office desk. "Problem?" he asked, observing her altered expression. "My mother," Marina said, still trembling with anger. "She can't accept that I can be happy, that someone can truly love me." Luke stood up and hugged her, feeling the tension in her muscles. What did she say? That I should be grateful I managed to get a husband considering my limitations, that I don't need to invent romantic stories about being in love. Luke pulled her back slightly so he could look into her eyes, and Marina saw a cold, controlled anger in his gaze. Marina, listen to something and never forget it. You are not limited in anything. You are intelligent, strong, beautiful, courageous. Any man would be lucky to have you as a wife. I am lucky to have you as a wife. Do you really believe that? I believe it so much that I'm going to prove it to you and to anyone who doubts it. He held her face between his hands. At our wedding, I'll make sure everyone sees how proud I am to call you my wife. Marina kissed his lips, feeling how love was slowly healing wounds she had carried for years. But a part of her knew that the confrontation with her family was just beginning, because people like Helen Hamilton Price did not accept being challenged easily, and Marina was about to discover how far her family was willing to go to maintain control over a daughter who had dared to be happy against all expectations. The invitation arrived on a sunny April morning, delivered by a special courier who had driven 3 hours from Washington, D.C. to deliver it personally. Marina recognized the expensive paper and the Hamilton Price golden crest even before opening the envelope sealed with red wax. It was an invitation to Isabella's wedding to Roderick Montgomery, Jr., heir to a traditional London banking family. The ceremony would be held at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, with a reception for 500 guests. The date, just 2 weeks before Marina's wedding to Luke. It's no coincidence, Marina said, showing the invitation to Luke as they had breakfast on the porch. My mother is trying to force me to choose between attending the family wedding or staying here for my own wedding. Luke glanced over the invitation, noting how Marina's name had been included almost as an addendum. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Hamilton Price request the pleasure of the company of Marina Hamilton Price and guest. They hadn't even bothered to include his name. And what do you want to do? He asked, though he could see the turmoil in Marina's green eyes. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to ignore it completely, but another part... Luke, I know my family treated me badly, but it's still my family. And Isabella is my sister, even with all the problems between us. Luke nodded, understanding the dilemma. He himself knew how complicated family ties could be, how even toxic relationships left scars difficult to ignore. Then let's go, he said, surprising Marina. What do you mean, let's go? Let's go to your sister's wedding. Together. Luke leaned forward, taking Marina's hands in his. You shouldn't have to choose between attending your family's wedding or preparing for ours, and I'd like to meet these people who were so important in your upbringing. Marina felt her chest tighten, with emotion and apprehension. Luke, you don't understand what they're like. They'll try to humiliate you, humiliate me. They'll do everything to make me feel small again. Marina, he said, with that firm voice she had learned to associate with security, you are no longer the same person who left London months ago. You're strong now. You know who you are and what you're worth, and I'll be by your side the whole time. The decision to attend the wedding triggered a series of intense preparations. Mary Ann insisted on hiring a seamstress from Washington, D.C. to create a special dress for Marina. That family of yours will see that you're no longer the girl they despised, she declared, with fierce determination. When the dress was ready, Marina barely recognized herself in the mirror. It was a navy blue silk design that enhanced her eyes and gently hugged the curves that ranchwork had defined. The fabric was simple but elegant, and the tailoring impeccable. It wasn't ostentatious like the dresses her mother and sister preferred, but it had a timeless elegance that radiated confidence. Luke in turn invested in a custom-made suit, tailored by the same tailor who dressed Washington, D.C. businessmen. When Marina saw him ready, her heart raced. He was devastatingly elegant, but without losing that solid, masculine essence that had attracted her since their first meeting. You look handsome, she said, adjusting his tie. And you look stunning, he replied, kissing her forehead. Let's show your family who you really are. The trip to New York City was the first time Marina had left the ranch since her arrival. During the flight, she felt her stomach churn with nervousness, but Luke's calm presence beside her reassured her. He held her hand, gently stroking her skin, in a caress that said more than words. The Plaza Hotel was at its maximum splendor for the Hamilton Price Montgomery wedding. Imported flowers decorated the main ballroom, an army of waiters circulated with French champagne, and guests displayed jewels and clothes that cost more than the annual salary of most Americans. Marina and Luke arrived punctually, but did not go unnoticed. Whispers began as soon as they entered the ballroom, and Marina recognized many familiar faces from London high society. Everyone watched her with ill-disguised curiosity, clearly intrigued by her presence and especially by the imposing man accompanying her. Helen Hamilton Price appeared quickly, gliding through the ballroom with the false smile Marina knew so well. She was thinner than ever, covered in excessive jewelry, and her expression barely concealed her unpleasant surprise at seeing her daughter. "Marina," she exclaimed, kissing the air next to her daughter's face. "What a surprise! We didn't expect you to be able to absent yourself from your rural activities." "Mother," Marina replied, with a calm she didn't feel. This is Luke Foster, my fiancé." Helen studied Luke from head to toe with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating cattle at an auction. "Mr. Foster," she said, extending her hand with that typical arrogance of someone who expects their fingers to be kissed. Luke, however, merely shook her hand firmly, as he would with anyone. "Mrs. Hamilton Price, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Helen's embarrassment was visible. She was not accustomed to being treated as an ordinary person, especially by someone she considered socially inferior. "I imagine it must be interesting for you to be in an environment like this," she said with a venomous smile. "Very different from what you must be used to." "Actually," Luke replied with icy politeness, "I'm used to environments where people behave with authenticity. This here is what's new to me." Marina felt like applauding but maintained her composure. Helen was speechless for a few seconds, clearly not expecting to be confronted. Robert appeared next, greeting his daughter with his usual formality and studying Luke with professional interest. Foster, he murmured. "Aren't you the owner of those enormous lands out in Kansas? I heard you're revolutionizing sustainable agriculture." "Among other things," Luke replied modestly. Robert suddenly showed genuine interest. "I'd like to discuss some investments I'm considering in agribusiness." "Robert," Helen interrupted, clearly annoyed by the turn of the conversation. "You can't monopolize our guests. We have other commitments." It was at that moment that Isabella made her triumphant entrance into the ballroom, radiant in a wedding dress that had cost a fortune and transformed her into a fairy tale princess. She shone under the crystal chandeliers, receiving compliments and praises from all sides. When her eyes met Marina's, however, her expression changed completely. There was surprise, irritation, and something Marina couldn't immediately identify. Envy. Because Marina was different, not just in her elegant dress or carefully styled hair, but in a deeper transformation that radiated from within. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with cosmetics or expensive clothes. It was the light of someone who had found her place in the world. "Marina," Isabella said, approaching with a smile that didn't match the hardness in her eyes. "How good you could come. I thought you might have forgotten how to behave in society." "I haven't forgotten anything, Isabella," Marina replied, with a tranquility that surprised both sisters. "Congratulations on your wedding. This is Luke, my fiancé." Isabella studied Luke with the same predatory interest as her mother, but this time there was something more. Recognition that she was facing a man who would not be easily manipulated or impressed. "So you're the famous farmer who conquered our Marina," she said, with a tone meant to be condescending but which sounded merely petulant. "Actually," Luke said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "it was Marina who conquered me. Completely." The way he said it, looking directly at Marina with an expression of genuine adoration, made several nearby guests stop to observe. It was a display of love so evident and intense that it contrasted dramatically with the calculated behavior that dominated that environment. During dinner, Marina and Luke were deliberately placed at a distant table, along with less important relatives and some business guests. It was a clear humiliation, an attempt to keep Marina in her place. But Luke transformed that table into the liveliest of the party, conversing with genuine interest about the businesses and life stories of everyone present. "Your fiancé is charming," commented an elderly lady, a distant cousin of the Hamilton Prices. "It's been years since I've seen such a polite and interesting young man at these parties." Marina smiled, feeling pride and love overflowing in her chest. Luke wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply was who he was, and that proved more impressive than all the ostentation around. The real tension began after dinner, when Helen managed to isolate Marina in a more secluded corner of the ballroom. "Marina, we need to talk," she said, with that tone Marina knew well, the tone that came before the most painful humiliations. "About what, Mother?" "About this ridiculous charade you're putting on." Helen looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I thought you had outgrown this fantasy habit, but I see you haven't changed at all." "What fantasy?" "This story of love, of happiness, of being fulfilled. Marina, please, you were practically forced to marry this man to save our family. You don't need to pretend it's a fairy tale." Marina felt the familiar anger rise in her throat, but this time there was a difference. She had the strength to fight back. "I'm not pretending anything, Mother. I truly love Luke, and he loves me. I am happy." Helen laughed with cruel disdain. "Love? Marina, you've always been too naive. This man accepted you because he was desperate for an educated wife. Any one would do, you were just available. You're wrong. Wrong. Darling, I've known men much longer than you. They're practical. Luke needed a wife who would bring some status, some refined education to his rustic world. You needed a husband. It was a convenient transaction for both. Don't confuse convenience with love." Every word was a calculated stab at Marina's deepest insecurities. For years, Helen had planted and watered these seeds of doubt, and now she was trying to use them again. "Look around you, Marina," Helen continued, relentless. "See all these important people, all this elegance, all this life. You could have had if you weren't so peculiar. You traded all that for a simple life in the countryside with a man you barely know. And you're pretending it was a choice made out of love." For a terrible moment, Marina felt the old insecurities try to resurface. What if her mother was right? What if Luke had really accepted her only out of convenience? What if she was misinterpreting his feelings? But then her eyes found Luke across the ballroom. He was talking to Robert about agricultural techniques, but even from afar she could see how he periodically sought her out with his gaze, as if making sure she was all right. When their eyes met, he smiled, a smile that was only hers, laden with all the love they had discovered together. And Marina remembered all the mornings she had woken up with Luke watching her sleep, as if she were something precious he feared losing. She remembered how he had defended her from Mark Spencer, how his hands trembled slightly whenever he touched her, how his voice changed when he spoke about her to other people. "You are mistaken, Mother," Marina said with a firmness that made Helen recoil slightly. "Luke loves me, and I'm sure of it because I know what it's like to be truly loved, something I never knew in this house." "Marina, I'm not finished." Marina's voice was low but charged with a new authority that silenced Helen. "I spent 26 years trying to be worthy of this family's love, trying to fit in, trying to be what you wanted me to be. And I never succeeded, because you never wanted to love me. You wanted to mold me. We tried to educate you, to prepare you for a decent life." "You tried to erase me," Marina interrupted, "to make me disappear so that only the parts of me you approved of remained. But Luke sees me whole. He loves my intelligence, my compassion, my strength. He loves who I truly am, not an edited version of me." Helen was visibly shaken. She had never seen Marina react with such determination. "And you know what, Mother?" Marina continued, feeling decades of pain and resentment finally find a voice. "I discovered you were right about one thing. I really don't belong in this world, because this world is superficial, cruel, and empty, and I deserve better." How dare you? I dare because I finally learned to value myself. Luke taught me that. He taught me that I don't need to beg for love, because I deserve to be loved exactly as I am. At that moment, Luke appeared beside them, having perceived the tension even from afar. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, with a calm that didn't completely disguise the contained fury at seeing Marina visibly upset. "I was just leaving," Helen said, trying to regain her composure. "I have other guests to receive." She walked away quickly, but Marina could see that her words had hit their target. For the first time, Helen Hamilton Price had been confronted by her own daughter and didn't know how to react. "What did she say?" Luke asked, gently touching Marina's arm. "The same old things, trying to convince me that I don't deserve to be happy, that you don't truly love me." Marina looked into his eyes. "But I didn't believe it. Not for a second." Luke pulled her into his arms right there, in the middle of the crowded ballroom, and kissed her with an intensity that made it clear to everyone present exactly what he felt for her. When they separated, several guests watched them with expressions ranging from surprise to admiration. Helen, across the ballroom, was livid. "Let's go," Luke said. "You've already proven what you came here to prove." "What did I come to prove?" "That you are no longer the woman they tried to make you believe you were. You are strong, courageous, and you deserve to be loved, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." They walked out arm in arm, ignoring the whispers and glances that followed them. At the hotel door, Marina turned one last time to observe the world she was definitively leaving behind. She felt no sadness, only a deep peace and the certainty that she was finally going home. The sun rose golden over the Great Plains on the morning of Marina and Luke's wedding, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange that seemed to have been chosen especially for that day. St. Helens Ranch had never looked so beautiful, decorated with an elegant simplicity that respected the natural beauty of the place. Marina woke up in the room she had occupied for the past few months, but that night she would definitively leave it to move into the main bedroom, where she would spend the rest of her life beside the man who had completely changed her understanding of love and herself. Through the window, she could see the final preparations: rustic wooden tables arranged under the native trees, simple but elegant chairs adorned with white ribbons and Great Plains flowers, a makeshift altar near the creek, where she had so often talked with Luke about dreams and the future. It was exactly the wedding she had dreamed of, though she had only discovered she dreamed of it after arriving at the ranch. No ostentation, no hundreds of unknown guests, just the people who truly mattered, celebrating something true in an atmosphere of genuine joy. Mary Ann entered the room carrying a tray with coffee and fruit, but Marina could see her eyes shining with tears of contained emotion. "The special day has arrived, my girl," she said, placing the tray on the table and opening the curtains completely to let the golden light into the room. "Are you ready to be the happiest woman in the world?" "I already am," Marina replied with a sincerity that made Mary Ann's heart ache with affection. "Since the day I arrived here and was welcomed with true love." During breakfast, they talked about the last preparations, but Marina could barely concentrate on the food. It wasn't nervousness, it was pure anticipation. The good anxiety of someone who knows something wonderful is about to happen. At 10 in the morning, a car arrived from Washington, D.C. Marina watched from the window, curious to know who it could be, as all the expected guests had already arrived the day before. To her complete surprise, the person who stepped out of the vehicle was Edward Foster, accompanied by an elegant woman she didn't recognize. Half an hour later, Luke knocked on her room door. "Marina, can I come in? There's someone here who wants to meet you." She opened the door to find Luke with a strange expression, something between surprise and amusement. Behind him was the woman who had arrived with Edward, a lady in her 60s with elegantly styled grey hair and kind eyes that reminded her of Luke's. "Marina," Luke said with a smile he couldn't hide, "this is Carmen Foster, my grandmother. She insisted on coming all the way from Ireland to meet you." The woman stepped forward and hugged Marina with an affection that resembled Mary Ann's, but with the dignity of someone accustomed to family authority. "Beautiful girl," she said, with a soft Irish accent that made her words even more affectionate. "I've wanted to meet you for months." Luke talks about you constantly in the letters he sends me. Marina felt her face flush. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carmen. Just Carmen, dear. And listen, I brought something for you. She opened a velvet box she held in her hands, revealing a simple but beautiful pearl necklace, clearly antique and very well cared for. These pearls belong to my mother, and to her mother before that. All the Foster family brides have worn them. I want you to be the next. Marina was speechless, delicately touching the pearls with trembling fingers. No one had ever offered her something so significant, so laden with family history and tradition. I can't accept something so valuable. Of course you can. You're part of the family now. Carmen closed Marina's hands over the box. Luke chose you, and that means you have my heart, too. When Luke and his grandmother left so Marina could begin to get ready, she stood holding the pearl box, trying to process how completely her life had changed. A few months ago, she was the rejected daughter no one wanted around. Now, she was being accepted into a family that welcomed her with generations of traditions, with unconditional love. The process of dressing for the wedding was a completely different experience from any she had ever lived. There was no unnecessary rush, no one making critical comments about her appearance, no artificial tension. Marianne and Carmen helped her, with patience and affection, every detail handled with the attention given to something sacred. The dress they had chosen was perfect, simple white silk, cut to enhance her natural beauty without ostentation. The family pearls completed the ensemble in a way that seemed to have been planned by fate. When Marina looked in the mirror for the last time, she saw a woman who had never existed before, radiant, confident, loved. You look stunning, Carmen said, adjusting a last strand of Marina's hair. Luke will melt when he sees you. The guests began to arrive in the late afternoon. There were about 30 people, ranch staff with their families, some close neighbors, a few friends of Luke who came from Washington, D.C., and Edward with some relatives who insisted on being present. Marina watched from the bedroom window, feeling a different emotion grow in her chest. All those people were there by choice because they truly wanted to celebrate the love she and Luke had found. There were no social obligations, ulterior motives, or appearances to maintain. It was pure celebration. The priest who would celebrate the ceremony was a simple man from the nearby town, known to Luke. Since childhood, there was no ecclesiastical pomp, just the simplicity of someone who truly believed in the sacrament he was celebrating. When the time came, Marina walked alone towards the altar. She had considered asking Edward to accompany her to Luke, but decided she wanted to make that journey on her own, symbolizing the path she had taken to reach that moment. The sound of a guitar accompanied her steps, played by one of the ranch staff who had musical talent. The melody was a classic American song about true love, simple and beautiful like everything else that day. When Marina appeared at the entrance of the space where the ceremony would take place, a murmur of admiration spread among the guests. But she only had eyes for Luke, who was waiting at the altar, with an expression that mixed love, admiration, and something very close to awe. He wore a simple dark suit without excess, but he was devastatingly elegant. His hair was carefully combed, but Marina could see his hands trembling slightly, a groom's nervousness that made her smile tenderly. When she reached the altar, Luke extended his hand to help her up the 2 steps to where he stood. The touch of their hands was like an electric shock that confirmed to both of them that this moment was real, was theirs, was forever. "You're too beautiful to be real," Luke whispered, low enough for only her to hear. "I am real," she whispered back, "and I'm here forever." The ceremony was simple and touching. The priest spoke about love as a daily choice, about building a life based on mutual respect and shared growth. The words were directed specifically at Marina and Luke, not a generic text memorized for any couple. When it was time for the vows, Luke spoke first. "Marina, when you arrived here months ago, I thought I was receiving someone who needed help, but I discovered that it was I who needed help. You taught me that there's a difference between being accompanied and not being alone. You brought light to places I didn't even know were dark. I promise to spend the rest of my life loving you, not just for who you are, but for what you helped me to be." Marina felt tears stream down her face, but when it was her turn to speak, her voice came out firm and clear. "Luke, you saved me from a life that wasn't mine. You not only brought me to your home, but you brought me to myself. You taught me that I deserve to be loved, that I have worth, that I can be strong. I promise to love you not just on easy days, but especially on difficult ones. I promise to build with you a life that is ours, true, and full of all the love I've learned I have to give." The rings were blessed and exchanged, simple gold bands that Luke had commissioned from a local jeweler, engraved inside with the date of that day and their initials. "By the powers vested in me by the Church and the American state, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The kiss was different from all the others they had exchanged. It was a sealing of a promise, a confirmation of a future, a celebration of love conquered against all odds. When they separated, the guests applauded with genuine enthusiasm, and Marina felt as if she were floating. The party that followed was exactly as they had dreamed, regional food prepared by Mary Ann and her helpers, live music played by the guests themselves, dancing under the stars that shone over the Great Plains without the interference of urban lights. Marina danced with Luke, with Edward, with ranch staff who had welcomed her like a daughter. She laughed loudly, without worrying if the sound was appropriate or composed. She played with the children present, talked with the women about local plants and cuisine, listened to stories from the older men about the old days of the region. She was herself completely, without filters or masks. Around 10 o'clock that night, when the party was at its peak, a car stopped at the ranch entrance. Marina, who was dancing with Luke, didn't even notice its arrival. It was Edward who approached the couple with a curious expression. "Luke, someone here is asking for Marina," he said. "A woman from London says she's family." Marina felt her stomach churn. She knew instinctively who it was even before turning to look. Helen Hamilton Price stood at the edge of the party area, visibly out of place in the rural setting with her designer dress and high heels sinking into the dirt ground. She looked smaller and more fragile than Marina remembered, and there was something in her expression that Marina couldn't immediately identify. "Mother," Marina said, approaching slowly. "What are you doing here?" Helen looked around, observing the simple but joyful party, the rustic but elegant decor, the guests who were clearly having a genuinely good time. "I came to see you," she said, with a voice that sounded strange to Marina's ears. "I came to apologize." Marina remained silent, processing words she had never expected to hear from her mother. Apologize for what? For everything. For not seeing who you truly are. For trying to make you someone you never were. For sending you away like that. Helen paused, looking directly into her daughter's eyes. For not knowing how to love you properly. Luke approached, placing a protective hand on Marina's shoulder, but didn't interfere in the conversation. "What changed?" Marina asked, genuinely curious. "I saw you both at Isabella's wedding. I saw how he looks at you, how you shine when you're with him. I saw that you are happy in a way I never managed to make you." Helen lowered her eyes, and I realized I lost a daughter due to arrogance and blindness. Marina felt conflicting emotions warring in her chest. Part of her wanted to hug her mother and forgive everything immediately. Another part remembered decades of humiliation and rejection that could not be erased with a simple apology. "Mother," she finally said, "I accept your apologies, but you need to understand that I am no longer the same person who left London. I have changed. I found my place in the world, and that place is here." "I know," Helen replied, surprising Marina with her sincerity, "and perhaps that's what I came to do. Not to ask you to come back, but to tell you that I'm proud of the woman you've become." These were words Marina had dreamed of hearing her entire life, but now that she heard them, she realized she no longer needed them to feel complete. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It means a lot to me." Helen nodded, looked one last time at the party around them, at the genuine joy, at the true love that permeated every detail, and headed back to the car. "Marina," she called before leaving, "be happy. You deserve to be happy." When the car disappeared down the dark road, Marina stood still for a few moments, processing what had happened. Luke hugged her from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," she replied, with surprise in her own voice. "For the first time in my life, completely free." They returned to the party, which continued late into the night. Marina danced, laughed, celebrated with an intensity that came from knowing that this was her real life, her chosen family, her true love. When the last guests had left and they were alone, Marina and Luke walked hand in hand to the edge of the creek, where so many important conversations had happened. "Mrs. Foster," Luke said, trying out the new name. "I like how it sounds," she replied, smiling, "though it's still strange to think that someone wants me enough to share their name with me." Luke stopped walking and turned to face her completely. "Marina, you have no idea what it means to me to have you in my life. It's not just love. It's as if you've shown me colors I'd never seen before. You did the same for me," she said, touching his face with delicate fingers. "You showed me that I can be loved exactly as I am." They kissed under the starlight, husband and wife, two hearts that had found each other against all expectations. In the months that followed, Marina flourished even more. She took on responsibilities in ranch management, implemented environmental education projects for local communities, and began writing about rural sustainability for specialized magazines. Luke observed her transformation with growing admiration. The shy woman who had arrived at the ranch had become a natural leader, respected by the staff, beloved by the local community, and regionally recognized for her work. When they learned Marina was pregnant, 6 months after the wedding, Luke cried with joy. They were going to form a family based on true love, mutual respect, and the certainty that every child they brought into the world would be loved unconditionally. "What shall we name her?" Luke asked, his hands resting on Marina's still small belly. "Hope," she said without hesitation, "because that's what you gave me when I needed it most." Years later, when Marina looked back, she could barely believe the journey she had undertaken. The woman who had once been considered the ugly daughter was now the mother of 3 beautiful children, wife to a man who adored her, leader of a community that respected her. She had learned that true beauty had nothing to do with external standards, but with the courage to be authentic. She had discovered that family isn't who shares your blood, but who chooses to love you every day. And she had understood that sometimes fate needs to break you completely before teaching you how to rebuild yourself stronger. St. Helens Ranch had become a national reference in sustainable agriculture, but for Marina it was simply home. The place where she had discovered who she truly was, where she had learned to love and be loved, where she had built a life that was true. And when her daughters asked about her story, about how she had met their father, about how she had come to the ranch, Marina proudly told them about the journey that had transformed her from rejected to loved, from invisible to indispensable, from ugly daughter to a complete woman. Because in the end, that had always been the truth no one had been able to see. She had always been everything Luke had ever dreamed of, and he had always been everything she never knew she was looking for. Love had won, truth had prevailed, and they lived happily ever after, not because life became perfect, but because they learned that true love turns any imperfection into beauty.